The following is an Ice on Mars presentation.
Beneath a sky thickening with summer thunderheads, they rode their bikes to Lafayette Cemetery, where the dead are buried above ground. The four of them flew down Chestnut Street, their wheels bouncing over flagstones wrenched by the gnarled roots of oak trees. They passed high wrought-iron fences beyond which Doric and Ionic columns held up the facades of Greek Revival mansions, their screened porches shrouded in tangles of vines. The canopy of oak branches began at Jackson Avenue, by the bell tower of Bishop Polk Cathedral, which rose 30 feet into the air, its ceramic tiled portico crowned by a blinding gold-plated crucifix. The neighborhood, with its sprawl of raised Creole cottages and classical mansions, stretched for blocks. Their ride to the cemetery on Washington Avenue took them through sunlight dappled across the uneven asphalt of the floral-rimmed streets of the Garden District. The greatest fear of their 13th summer was the appearance of cars. Meredith would never be able to forget the day the gate was locked and the rain fell. So begins A Density of Souls by Christopher Rice. This episode on
Dread.dialectic.
Dread.dialectic.
And welcome back, everybody. This is Michael T. Bradley.
And this is Scix.
And today we're going to be discussing a book from a child of a famous horror author, which we haven't done any Joe Hill on here, but I think we've maybe mentioned Joe Hill. Joe Hill, of course, Stephen King's kid, and done some really good stuff out there. I was a big fan of Horns. Now we're going to look at Christopher Rice, A Density of Souls, not A Destiny of Souls. I keep wanting to say it the wrong way there. Before we talk about the book, let me just, of course, pimp out the email address. That's dread.dialectic@gmail.com. Let us know if you agree, disagree, or if you have suggestions for other novels that we might do. So, Scix, this was your week. You are the person who read this book. I read a little bit of it just to get a taste of it. But why don't you give us a basic plot outline?
Absolutely. And for those not following quite along, Christopher Rice is the son of Anne Rice, noted vampire writer who kind of started the modern pretty boy vampire movement, fame hog, and shutdowner of fanfics, but I'm not bitter. But this is her son. The story mostly takes place around four childhood friends, Emily, Stephen, Greg, and Brandon, who are going to a private school in New Orleans, and they grow up kind of more or less together. When they're at high school age, Greg's younger brother gets killed in a car accident. Greg's mother gets carted off to an asylum, and Greg appears to shoot himself in a belfry. And then Steve and Emily go about their way. Brandon gets sent to military school because suddenly he's violent. Forward 6 years or so, Stephen is super gay. I mean, he was all along, but he's more or less given up trying to hide it.
Like he wears a cloak
Dun,
now.
dun, 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 dun. And he's in a gay quarter of New Orleans when a bomb blows up his boyfriend and a block. So he decides to go back home for a little while. And meanwhile, Brandon's older brother. Brandon's the wild one who was sent to military school. Jordan, his older brother, is trying to find Brandon because he's disappeared. He was only there for a few months and then he disappeared. So he's trying to find his brother. He's not sure he wants to find his brother because his brother was pretty bizarre and his parents are just like not talking about it. So he goes back home and he's trying to track down Brandon's friends. Greg, of course, is dead. Super gay Stephen and Emily, who became a writer. He finds each of them to try and talk to them to learn more about where Brandon is. Jordan and Stephen wind up hooking up. But as they hook up and everyone's kind of trying to find out the truth of the story of what happened the night Greg died and where Brandon is and all that, then the story suddenly changes into a religio-terrorist cult story, and then it flips back into small-town intrigue and crazy aunt in the attic kind of stuff, and then a hurricane. and everyone's sort of dashed against each other, and then they either have sex or kill each other or die, and then at the end, everything's covered in mud and dripping away, and like la-di-da, fiddly-dee, tomorrow's another day, and don't you ever tell this to anyone.
Is this even a horror novel?
That was another point of discussion. I got this title recommended from a friend. I said, can you recommend any horror novels with some diversity of cast? And they said, fair enough, this isn't really a horror novel, but you should try this. Now, when I request a horror novel, and I hear this isn't really a horror novel, I assume it's horror adjacent.
Right.
This isn't as horror-y as I would have liked, but there is thriller-y aspects. I mean, there's murder and mayhem and terror. A case could be made, but we really haven't spent a lot of time discussing what is horror.
Yeah.
It obviously, with the way things are, would be shelved in gay and lesbian interests at a bookstore. So I'm not sure whether a bookstore would call it horror or not.
I'm just curious because like on my Kindle I grabbed the free sample of this and read that much, and it's like you should read these other books, and so the Vines had the most horror novel sounding name to it, so I read the description for that, and it definitely sounds straight up horror. It's like an evil entity feeds on the tears of a jilted wife and blah blah blah, whereas this sounds like kind of a fried green tomatoes-esque exploration of the dark side of humanity.
Sort of. I mean, I'd say it's Southern Gothic.
All right.
It has a ghostly element. It's not a big part of it, but it is in there.
Who's the one who shoots himself in the belfry?
Greg.
So like I picture Greg just coming by in the background as a ghost at one point, being like, "Ooh, anyway, back to the story."
Almost.
Actually, before we keep talking more in depth about the book, how about we go ahead and why don't you give us the trigger warnings?
Yes, and like if you really want to read this and you don't want anything at all spoiled ever, don't even listen to the trigger warnings.
Okay.
Because it becomes a central plot point. Trigger warning for rape, murder. No dogs died that I'm aware of.
No dogs were harmed.
No dogs were harmed.
So now let's do, like we always do, we're going to do the good, bad, and the ugly. We're going to try to save the spoilerific stuff for the ugly, although I have some questions that I feel might accidentally cause spoilers, like, for instance, asking, is this a horror novel? But we'll try to stick to good and the bad being just things we liked and disliked that aren't necessarily... that hopefully don't include a lot of spoilers. So, Scix, since you read it, why don't you start us out with the good? It's
an interesting cast. All of the people are interesting. Orientation-wise, it's kind of diverse. We've got a few gay people. We've got a bi guy. We've got some fucked up repressed people who might be anything, really, if they were allowed to be themselves. That's actually the source of some of the violence. A lot of the danger reads to me very real. In the early bits where they're in high school, and we spent a lot of time with Steven in high school, and like his former friends put fag on the back of his book bag, so he's walking down and he's got that tag on his back, and he walks by the trophy case and there's a picture of Jordan, and he immediately gets a crush on Jordan, and he goes in later and steals the photo, and he knows he's gonna get killed if people find out, but he's just doing the best he can as a stupid teenager who doesn't know how to do anything but just survive until he can get out of there.
So what time period is the teenager set in?
The modern part is 2003, so 5 or 6 years before that.
So we've got pre and post 9/11, basically. Always try to pull 9/11 into the discussion if I can.
And I mean, the hurricane barreling down Louisiana, this is pre-Katrina as well. Chris in the afterwards said he sort of ramped it up for dramatic effect, and then Katrina was even worse.
A good diverse cast.
I kind of like the Southern Gothic style of story. Okay, I say they're in New Orleans. They're like just outside of New Orleans, so it's like a small town, even though they're like right butt up against the big city. And I like the small town where everyone has secrets sort of story. I like the unfolding where, like, on the surface everything's just peachy keen, and then it starts to unravel, sometimes with very little tugging. I find that interesting. You couldn't see it because I'm audio, but I kind of rolled my eyes as I was describing how it changed to a different kind of book a couple times. But most of them were interesting. The transitions were just jarring.
It sounds a lot like Robert R. McCammon's Boy's Life to me, or maybe a less horrific Dan Simmons' Summer of Night, that kind of kids in the summer in the South coming up against things that are maybe a little bigger than them.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Some of what they discover are like the sins of the previous generation, and that's kind of standard fodder. They don't go into like way back generations like a lot of Southern Gothic will do. Like they'll go back to slave owning times.
Right.
It's a little misleading. The opening section, the kids are playing in a cemetery. We got the Son of Anne Rice. We got the kids playing in a cemetery. Okay, we got the feel for this. No, they never go back to the cemetery. It doesn't matter.
So let's talk about the bad. What did you not like about this book?
Starting at broad surface level, everybody's white. It's Louisiana. Everybody's white. The epitome of beauty is Stephen, and he's tall and thin and willowy and blonde. Just like his mom's books, actually. And actually, he's tall and thin and blonde by pure coincidence. The author, I mean.
I'm assuming Christopher Rice grew up with lots of paintings and photographs of Brad Pitt.
Since we started this podcast in particular, I just kind of cast an eye out for diversity and issues of that sort.
Sure.
I do think the LGBT representation was well written. The mother being carted off to the asylum is definitely the southern crazy aunt locked in a cupboard trope, and it's not particularly. It's a cliche, and it's ableist, and there's that the trigger for rape. I'm going to talk about that now.
Okay.
So we discovered that when Greg shot himself in the belfry, there was more going on. So when Jordan finds Stephen, he asks him about it because he has reason to believe Stephen knows something. And what happens is Greg left a note for Stephen to meet him in the belfry, raped Stephen, and then Stephen passed out. Greg died by gunshot, and then Stephen was being carried away by Emily. Okay, I'm going to back up a little because the reason he raped him is because he's a rapist. The justification, the setup, is that when they were younger, I'm told straight guys do this all the time, they kind of jerked off together. So Greg blamed Stephen for any feelings that raised, I guess, and considered Stephen corruption, I would say. And so, like, as he was raping, he was like, "This is the way you want it, huh? This is the way you want it, huh?" He was just broken at that point. So Stephen tells this story to Jordan years later, right? And Jordan is Brandon's older brother. And Jordan says, the reason he raped you is because you are so beautiful and have so much charisma and charm, you enchant people. You're a witch, and that's why he raped you.
So it's kind of the smiley face version of you bring out the monster in men for young Christian women,
Yes.
that narrative.
Yeah.
Got it.
So Stephen attacks Jordan, because Jordan just said something horrible. And as they're kind of tussling, Jordan essentially makes it apparent that the reason he, quote, knows this, that Stephen bewitched him, was because Stephen had done the same to him, to Jordan. So Jordan had fallen in love with Stephen, and of course it was Stephen's fault for bewitching him, even though Stephen didn't know any of this shit.
She's just so goddamn beautiful, Scix.
Right. So this comes out in conversation while they're fighting, and so it kind of does what happens in movies when people fight who are secretly in love.
Sure.
And Stephen doesn't seem into it for a long time. He just kind of like, what, this is weird, my boyfriend just got blown up, like 2 days ago.
Does Jordan, once it gets more physical, does he yell, "This is how you want it," huh? I mean, it doesn't go that far into the creepy.
It does not go that far, but our narration, I quoted the line to you. After they wind up fucking, Stephen wakes up and he checks himself for bruises and cuts, because the violence was a necessary beginning to their lovemaking or something like that. Gross. I find Greg's character, I actually find him believable. And straight people don't believe us when we talk about people doing that to us. How they sort of dabble and then turn and bite, and people die that way. And that's when people use the gay panic defense in murder trials. What's left out is often, we actually had sex and I liked it and then I killed him. Not, he hit on me and then I killed him. That tends to get left out. That's stuff that happens. And I think Christopher may have had some experience, not directly with like being necessarily raped in a bell tower, but that kind of that turning, that sort of Jekyll and Hyde that just happens sometimes, and it's terrifying, and it's why the whole assumed fantasy of gay people hitting on straight people, I'm not saying it never happens, but it's dangerous. It's not it's not common, it's not normal, it's a dangerous game. It's like running in traffic.
Right.
So I think there's some good in the portrayal of it, but the aftermath where Jordan and Steven hook up, I think is really unhealthy.
So my question for you would be, and I haven't read it, so I mean I'm assuming it's just more about the way that it's handled, and maybe because of that weird kind of, you talking about that reminds me of a story from the book I Never Told Anyone, which is, I think it's all women. There might be some guys in there as well, but I believe it's all women telling stories of being molested when they were young, and how, essentially they, and a lot of them relate it to what happened when they opened up about it to their family or to whomever, and how they weren't believed, and so on and so forth. And it's why this kind of culture of shame has existed with those sorts of things. And one of the women relates a story, and I mean, I don't remember the details, but essentially, like, I was a young girl, an older person molested me, and she says that she first told that to a boyfriend of hers in her 20s while they were in bed together, and he basically, held her tight and said, "You must have been a really sexy little girl."
Yeah, gross.
It kind of reminds me of that, right? It's like this kind of like, you're just so beautiful. You're an angel. You just bring out these fucking gay feelings, whether you guys want it or not. And it's like, no, wait, that's not exactly victim blaming, but it's victim.
It's blaming.
Yeah. It's like victim blaming, but you get a badge too. It's weird.
Yeah. Now, just to maybe soften my critique a little, Jordan is the guy that Steven had a crush on back in school.
Right. He stole his picture from the...
Right. So there's some aspect of like, oh my god, this is happening?
Sure.
But again, he just relayed his rape to this guy 2 days before his boyfriend had been blown up in a terrorist attack. Nothing healthy is going to start this way.
But if action movies have taught us anything, right after your significant other dies horrifically, you are emotionally vulnerable and prone to falling for the jock Stallone-esque character,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. In Drawing Blood, you very much enjoyed or believed in the relationship between Zach and Trevor, maybe?
Mm-hmm.
And it involved a lot of violent interaction, kind of moving into the romantic relationship.
Yes.
What's the kind of divisor as to why this is upsetting and that wasn't?
Jordan thinks he's the white knight hero in the story, so he in no way checks himself. Like, he's doing good here, but what he's doing is he's really taking advantage of Steven's vulnerability, and Steven is shattered at this point. He's not even tracking, right? He's stunned. This is not a good time to fuck someone.
Right.
It kind of turns out okay. After a while, Steven eventually starts to sort of heal up from the trauma of the moment, and Jordan nurses him to health, and so I guess it's okay, and things can start bad and turn out okay, but that's the main difference, I think, because Jordan seems to me to be taking advantage of Steven.
All right. Okay, let's move on to the ugly. So from here on out, there will absolutely be spoilers. We'll be discussing the end of the book, things like that. So let me ask you this, Scix, because this is the thing that I keep wanting to ask about. In the prologue, when they're in the cemetery, one of them relates this little poem that his dad taught him. That's like, it's going to calm your mind, and it is damn near a Lovecraftian sort of poem about like, that is dead does not walk, and in the dark nothing speaks, and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And so I thought, okay, this is a book about they accidentally chanted this thing over a graveyard and zombies are going to attack the town.
Alas, no.
Does that play in at any point, or is it just truly not at all a horror novel?
It does play in, but it plays in like he thrusts his fists against the post and still insists he sees the ghost. It becomes a calming mantra of sorts. So let me give you, since we're in spoiler territory, I'll give you the the next level of secrets, because I've given a few secrets away. What we learn later on
is that Greg was controlled by an alien brain slug, and that's why he raped Steven.
No, but Emily was also in the clock tower. Emily shot Steven.
There's a whole fucking, like, book club going on up in that clock tower.
Right. So she shot Greg and rescued Steven. So all along she was holding this secret. Steven was holding his secret because he knew he thought Greg shot himself, but he didn't tell anyone that he had been up there. We also discover that the mom who went to the asylum wasn't crazy after all. Her husband was drugging her so he could have an affair. So his like brother ran the asylum, so he kept her in an empty wing of the asylum and kept her drugged. And this is kind of a horror trope going there. Emily sneaks in the window of the asylum, which is not a believable part of the story. She's the writer, so she's trying to collect everyone's stories as this goes on. So she breaks in, she starts talking to the catatonic mother until she kind of starts coming out, and she starts to learn that truth. And then in the final climax of the story, during the hurricane, Brandon, it is discovered. Remember Brandon from the military academy?
Violent.
Yeah.
And they were searching for him, right?
Right.
He causes the hurricane with his weather machine.
No, but he did set off the bomb that killed Steven's boyfriend. He set up a little enclave of God's warriors in the guest house. But the family had moved to another because they had more houses than they needed.
Right.
And so,
like you do.
So it was sort of a secret, But he had the God's warriors. His patter is all about infection and corruption, and it all started in the name of their little town. And we begin to see that he has a hard-on for Steven. I don't think sexually, but he sees Steven as a corrupting force.
Well, it's just because Steven is so attractive and he brings that side out of him.
Yeah, apparently. Yeah, that does start to pile up after a while, because Emily has the hots for Steven too.
Of course.
You can't be the one girl in a group of 4 and not have the hots for one of them.
Makes sense.
So, after he blows up his enclave and is the only survivor, because their vision doesn't match his anymore, he runs off into the swamp, and he starts having conversations with the ghost of Greg. Ghost, Greg, we're there, finally. Of course, he's not real, but still. From there on, we have the ghost of Greg and Brandon sort of teaming up to get Steven. In the climax, he bops Steven on the head and drags him up into the bell tower, of course.
And the ghost of Charles Whitman is there.
No. He ties Steven naked to the bell with wire fishing line for some reason, which I think would wind up cutting his hands off by the time he'd been hanging very long.
Yeah, jeez.
I mean, he's gonna kill him. He's talking to the ghost of Greg. The hurricane's tearing the place apart. Emily finds out where they are. She has a knife, and she's trying to stop Brandon. Eventually, gothically, he goes out the window of the bell tower and lands in the thronging flood. Probably dead. And then just barely saves Steven before the whole thing falls down.
So does Emily just go up to the bell tower weekly, making sure she doesn't have to save Steven this time? Is it just...
I think so.
Like, Steven, what shit have you gotten yourself into this time?
And the final twist secret, Christopher made a big deal in the afterword about, they asked me to remove this. So apparently, Steven's father...
is Greg.
No, but we're close. Steven's father had an affair with Jordan's mother, so Jordan and Steven are half-brothers.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun. But they never find this out. Their mothers kind of hatched out the secret and then vowed never to tell, because,
It just ends with them winking at each other.
Kinda, yeah. Well, actually, they were never going to talk to each other again in that southern way.
Oh, all right, fair enough.
But I mean, that was the big twist, and Christopher fought hard to keep that in. I don't know. They're not going to reproduce. I guess I don't give a shit. But he says that the reason they fell in love so quickly was because they saw themselves in each other because they were related. Which
that seems stupid. I'm like everything else I don't care about. That's the thing that I've always thought was, it's like if the big taboo on incest is that it'll fuck up the genes and you can have... I don't know if any of the terms that I know are PC or not, so I'm, children of a lesser god or whatever, right? if that's gonna happen, then my large collection of twin porn seems okay, right? Because they're not gonna have children.
Right. The taboo existed before anyone understood genetics, though. So there's that.
Why, I wonder?
People are gonna argue evolutionary psychology, but that's never convincing.
I'm not advocating everybody go out and fuck your family. I'm just saying I don't understand it.
You're not Richard O'Brien.
No, I don't.
Richard O'Brien, who wrote Rocky Horror Picture Show and Shock Treatment, both times he played a character who was fucking his sister. And I always think about if he has a real life sister, what she must think of those two movies.
Fair enough. As a gentle reminder for anyone listening who's thinking they should send us in a recommendation, we are trying to talk about horror novels on here. So it's I had the friend recommend Splitfoot, and it's this really isn't a horror novel. Choirville children were probably skating on the edge there, but yeah, please, let's see some werewolves or some shit, That's what we're looking for here.
And not fantasy werewolves, rend your throat out werewolves, man.
Damn straight. So at the end of the day, it sounds like you had very mixed feelings. Would you recommend this to someone, Scix?
I would. I would recommend it to anyone who I felt was not going to have a hard time with the rape scene.
I'm definitely curious to try the Vines, because from what I read of this, I dug Christopher's writing style. It did feel very Southern Gothic. The writing didn't necessarily suck me in, but it had this kind of gentle, soothing, you're in the hands of someone who knows what they're doing sort of feel. Maybe it's just because I've been reading so many indie books lately that I'm this feels like somebody who had an editor. Yes. An editor who got paid money.
In the afterword of this book, he actually doesn't quite apologize, but almost apologizes. I was 23. I can do better now. Okay.
Can't we all, Christopher? Can't we all?
Yes.
Again, if you have any suggestions or you want to disagree, whatever, on any of these points, drop us a note or leave a comment wherever you're seeing this. dread.dialectic@gmail.com or reply. If you accidentally hit the like and subscribe buttons, I'm not going to complain either. Next up, Nethereal, some sci-fi horror. For now, this is Michael T. Bradley.
And this is Scix Medics.
And we are